Hey team, and welcome to another video in the Astrological Magical Elections video series. Today we're going to talk about the magical electional opportunities we are going to have available to us between our Cancer New Moon and our Aquarius Full Moon from July 9th to July 24th. So today we actually have a good number of elections to talk about, and there's not really that much of an overlap between the different locations, so we're going to be able to do sort of our default style of video presentation today. But the location that has the most opportunities is definitely kind of Western Europe, Northern Africa. So we're going to start there, and then we'll move on to the other locations later on in the video. So our first talismanic opportunity for Western Europe, Northern Africa is going to be on July 14th at around 5 p.m. So like around, this chart is set for 1710. And this is going to be an opportunity to pick up a 13th Lunar Mansion talisman. Now, the 13th Lunar Mansion is one that is primarily focused on relationships, strengthening relationships, creating new relationships, and the imagery associated with the 13th Lunar Mansion tends to be very sexually oriented. So it's a little bit more that style of relationship. It's not super so much about, say, friendship, right? Or like alliances or things like that. Like there's not really like a platonic undertone to it. It's very erotic. So I say that to say this is not a talisman for like making you generally like for increasing your for like making new friends. It's not for that, but it's something that is more specifically involved with like romantic partnerships, really. But that's not all the 13th Lunar Mansion is for. It's also talked about within the context of curing or overcoming sexual dysfunction, so something to also keep in mind with this one. So turning to take a look at our election chart for this moment, we've got the moon here placed on the midheaven and in the 13th Lunar Mansion, and just kind of be really careful here because the moon is actually at the very, very, very end of the 13th Lunar Mansion. It passes over until the 14th at 17 degrees Virgo and 8 minutes. Which happens at 1738, so just about 28 minutes after after this chart here is set for. So that kind of tells you at what time you kind of need to be done with this. I try to leave like a little bit of wiggle room between the charts, or like before and after the charts for things to happen. But for this one, you kind of want to make sure you wrap up pretty quickly before the moon moves into a different mansion. But here the moon is in this mansion, and at this time she's applying the sextile to the sun. Really great for relationships, since the sun and moon kind of have this celestial marriage imagery kind of thing going on. At the same time, we've got Mars as ruler of the first house. Mars is here, placed in Leo, conjoined Venus, which I thought was really nice, especially since Venus rules the 7th house in this chart. So again, you kind of have these connections between these planets that represent married individuals or like individuals in relationships, whether that's kind of through a universal signification of this application between the sun and moon, or a more specific one in like the chart itself, where the ruler of the first house and the ruler of the 7th house of marriage and partnerships and relationships are together. It's just I really liked the chart and how it came together in this instance. So our second opportunity for Western Europe or Northern Africa is going to be, just about 24 hours later on July 15th at around 1712 or 5:12 p.m. And this is going to be an opportunity for a 15th Lunar Mansion talisman. And the 15th Lunar Mansion is one that is primarily associated with wealth and gain and trade, but also has associations with like friendships and alliances. So you can also be leaned in for that as well. And here in this one, we're going to kind of lean more into like the wealth and trade aspect of it, just because of the connections in the chart, I guess. But looking at our election chart here, we've got the moon in the 10th house, just at the very beginning of this mansion, and you'll notice that she's not on the midheaven exactly as I normally have her, and that's because I'm trying to maintain this trine that the sun has with the ascendant to kind of give it a little bit more oomph, we'll say, and to kind of save it, because at the same time... So as you'll notice throughout the rest of this video, really, I'm really leaning heavily into Scorpio ascendants, because Mars is conjoined Venus, basically. So Mars gets kind of uplifted by this relationship with Venus, but it's hard to have this emphasis on the Scorpio sign while Mars and Saturn are in signs that are square, that are configured by square to this sign. And while Saturn is definitely out of orb from the square of the ascendant, Mars is not. But then you have the conversation about what does it mean when the Lord of the first house is square of the ascendant? Oh, it means you kind of get in your own way. So we mitigate that by having the sun have a close trine with the ascendant to kind of get some space and to create like a barrier between any sort of other difficult aspect that the ascendant might undergo, because we want to make sure that the ascendant is protected. So that's why, even with the last election, I didn't point it out, but in that election also, the ascendant is configured to be in the same degree as the trine to the sun. So that's why we're kind of keeping these Scorpio ascendants and kind of popping along with the sun as we go forward. So there's that. A little trick to keep in mind for your own electional purposes, if you need them. Use the closer aspect of a much better planet to intervene and mitigate the difficult aspects of more malefic planets. Elections 101. So we have that happening here, while the ruler of the first house is Mars in Leo, conjoined Venus, getting propped up by that connection with Venus, while the moon is applying this square with Mercury. And so typically I don't super enjoy squares as connecting aspects, and even in this case I really still don't. But this connection with Mercury isn't so bad, since Mercury is a planet of like commerce and trade. So this could be a really great example of a 15th Lunar Mansion talisman that is more aligned with kind of the bartering and trading and commerce aspects of the mansion itself. The next thing that I wanted to talk about is not what I would necessarily call a talismanic opportunity, because I'm not sure that, I don't think it's a really great one, but it's something that I wanted to talk about because it's one of those things that looks like it could be a good electional opportunity, but I don't think it will be, kind of in practice. So this is sort of like being forewarned, I guess, of this. But this would be a potential for an Algorab fixed star talisman. But looking at our election, at the chart for this, we've got the moon conjoined the star here on the ascendant. The projected degree of Algorab is at 13 Libra, which is what's on the ascendant. And at this time she's applying this sextile to Mars, and Mars is one of the planets that Algorab is said to be of the nature of. But the issue is really the condition of the ruler of the first house, which is Venus, because Libra is on the ascendant. And Venus here in Leo isn't really doing super well. And so this is something that I think people might miss or maybe purposely overlook. And it's just because Venus kind of suffers from this conjunction with Mars. And one of the big things that we try to do in elections is to make sure that the ruler of the first house is safe. Because if it's not, it can manifest as like dangerous side effects, essentially, like something going awry with the talisman or its purpose, or like causing some sort of harm, I guess. I hesitate to use that word because I think that's a bit of a dramatic term, but like something doesn't work out right, the talisman doesn't agree so much with the person who's using it, and there can be like some blowback involved, we'll say, or just like it's inert, essentially, one of those two. And so with Venus conjoined Mars in an Algorab talisman, it's kind of like, because one of the main purposes of an Algorab talisman is actually to support or enhance the choleric humor inside of an individual. And so this is kind of an interesting situation where in the chart itself you have Venus representing the individual in a fire sign, which represents the choleric humor, and conjoined Mars, a planet that also represents the choleric humor. But Mars is actually like an extreme manifestation of the choleric humor, like an unhealthy manifestation of it. So while you want the moon application to Mars in an Algorab talisman, having Venus conjoin Mars I don't think is super safe, so just kind of watch out for this election. Maybe experiment with it if you kind of want to see what this might be like, but just kind of watch out for it. So our next electional opportunity for Western Europe and North Africa is actually, just more standard election, but it's a little bit different from the ones that I normally do. So this is not actually like a Lunar Mansion talisman, nor is it a planetary talisman, nor is it I guess it could kind of be classified as a planetary talisman, but anyway. So this talisman, the moon here is placed in the 18th Lunar Mansion, but this is not an 18th Lunar Mansion talisman, because if it were, it would be a really shitty one, since the 18th Lunar Mansion is more about physical health. But instead, this is me just kind of reminding you of a thing that I said in the last video, where I talked about the 4th Lunar Mansion talisman, and how it's good for pest control, but that you don't actually need the 4th Lunar Mansion to be useful against pests. That there are certain standard astrological configurations that you can make talismans for or during to have the same kind of power, and then you can alter it based on the image of the zodiac sign to match the particular pest that you are up against. So in the 4th Lunar Mansion, which is sort of like a general kind of a thing, and then you can specify it however you want with the imagery that you utilize in the talisman, but it takes place in Taurus, so you would have to lean more into like Taurian imagery if it was on the ascendant. But here is kind of like the flip side of it, where in that chart, the fourth Lunar Mansion chart back then, you had the moon caught between the squares of Mars and Saturn while she was in Taurus, and now we have it on the other side with the moon caught between the squares of Mars and Saturn while she is in Scorpio. So here's kind of what I mean. So the moon is separating from here and then going to the square of Mars. So she's classically besieged, is what we would say, when the moon is applying or stuck between the aspects of two malevolent planets, whether that is natural or accidental malefic planets. And this is what you want to do for pest control talismans. Normally, in elections, we're focused on building up like the moon and the ascendant and the ruler of the ascendant and things like that. Like we're working on building them up to making them as good and as strong or capable as possible, because that's usually what we want, or at least kind of the astrological magic that I kind of champion or want you guys to focus on, is that's more towards growth-oriented stuff. But of course, the dark side of it is that the decline is also sometimes necessary to tap into. And one of the ways that we tap into that and we utilize that is through pest control. And so this would be kind of your standard example of that, with the moon conjoining the ascendant in Scorpio, like I said, separating from the square of Saturn, applying to the square of Mars, really debilitated. And with the Scorpio ascendant here, this would be kind of a more classical insects, biting, stinging things. So like we have problems with ants. So ants and wasps here in Texas, of course. So will be using this, or not this one specifically because this is for Western Europe, but there's a North American version of this that I'll be using for that when the time comes. And so yeah, whatever kind of insect or arachnid that you are struggling against, here is an extra helping hand in taking care of it. So our final electional opportunity for Western Europe and Northern Africa is going to be on July 19th at around 5:11 p.m. And this is going to be an opportunity for a 19th Lunar Mansion talisman. And the 19th Lunar Mansion is one that is used primarily for magical safeguarding, so for shielding and warding, or it is more specifically indicated for uterine health issues. So if you need either of those things, this could be a great talisman or a great mansion to keep a lookout for in the future. The unfortunate part is that we're going to kind of start to lose the ability to use this mansion as the moon's node starts to kind of backward track through it. And we kind of are bashing up against that problem right now in this election. So let's talk about that. So in our election, we have the moon placed here in the ascendant in the 19th Lunar Mansion talisman, and she's applying a trine to the sun, while the sun is also trine to the ascendant degree. Mars, the ruler of the first house, is placed here in the 9th, in Leo, and conjoined Venus. So like I said before, we're really going to lean into this Mars rulership of Scorpio, and having Venus here help us out. And so all in all, it's set up pretty well. The downside, the potential is that the node is here. Not that it's in the first house, that's not a big deal, but that the moon is kind of applying closer to the conjunction of the node, and that's not great for the moon, even though they are about 14 degrees apart in this chart. So I say that to say that while this part here is really good, the Sun connection and the Mars-Venus connection are really good, the moon application to the node might ruin it for some people, which I think is fine and a perfectly fine thing to kind of shy away from. Like, yeah, I completely understand. But our options for talismans for this mansion are going to start to wane, like I said, as the node begins to kind of go back through, when the node enters Scorpio from the exit, and kind of goes back over this mansion, we're going to lose it. So while the moon's node connection here might not be super great, this might be, I don't want to be like, oh, this might be our last opportunity, so you should grab it, because it's not an excuse for making a talisman under potentially inauspicious conditions. It's not. But my point is more like, maybe this is an election that you grab, that you make a talisman for, but we just kind of temporarily, like, just treat it as kind of like a temporary talisman if you're going through a particularly rough time, or having like particularly difficult health issues that you're struggling with. Like, maybe it's fine to use this as more like an acute response kind of situation, knowing that this node is here, which could and just keep your feelers out for how it's manifesting, because the node moon connection is pretty far, so it might not be a big deal, but it might also be it's important to consider. So I throw this out as like as an offer, I guess, like, hey, this is coming up. I think it's mostly okay. There's this issue with it that I think is worth being aware of, and make your decision about whether or not you want to use it or not. So that's it for Western Europe and North Africa. They have the most electional opportunities, and now we're going to switch gears to North American continent, which we don't have a whole lot to talk about. But our first electional opportunity is going to be for July 13th at around 4 o'clock in the afternoon. This chart here is set for 1606, and this is that opportunity for the 13th Lunar Mansion talisman. The 13th Lunar Mansion is one that is primarily used for creation or preservation of romantic relationships. There is not really platonic undertones to it. It is much more of an erotic-focused talisman. If it is also utilized for overcoming sexual dysfunction, and it kind of is a little bit more heavily into male sexual health than female sexual health, which is something that we see more specifically addressed in the 19th Lunar Mansion. But the 13th Lunar Mansion can work for both. It just is a little bit more specialized in urology, we'll say. I would not necessarily recommend making this as a talisman to help create and support friendships. That's not really the kind of relationships that the 13th Lunar Mansion does. But in regards to like romance and love, the 13th Lunar Mansion is really useful. So taking a look at our election, we've got the moon here placed on the midheaven in the 13th Lunar Mansion. At this time, the moon is applying the sextile to the sun. It's pretty wide in this chart, about 15 degrees, but that is the moon's next aspect, the sextile with the sun, and that's always really fortunate in relationship type charts or talismans, because the sun and the moon kind of have this symbolism of like a celestial married couple, basically. So having that kind of connection with the moon in this talismanic collection is really good, kind of like the second choice to Venus, in my opinion. Speaking of Venus, let me kind of erase this line here. Speaking of Venus, Mars, the ruler of the first house, is conjoined Venus. And while Venus rules the 7th house in the election, and I just really like that kind of mirror with the ruler of the first house, which represents the person that the talisman is for, conjoined the ruler of the 7th house, which is like relationships, people that we relate to, marriage, things like that. So it's a really nice kind of cementing of the symbolism of the chart as sort of like a mundane election, coupled with the magical timing of the chart as well. Our next electional opportunity for the North American continent is going to be July 15th at around 11:30, and this is going to be the opportunity for the 15th Lunar Mansion talisman. The 15th Lunar Mansion is one that is primarily focused on like wealth and trade, the accumulation of money, which is also always very helpful. But it also has a use for like friendships and alliances. So it's kind of like the idea of like making good business partner connections is sort of the theme that the 15th Lunar Mansion is working with in regards to like its relationships, like its friendship and alliances. Kind of taking the idea of like a merchant's business connections, right, into the modern day, it could be really great for like professional networking kind of a thing. So while the texts talk about the 15th Lunar Mansion as one that's about friendship, I'm not really sure that it's the same kind of friendship that we would think about today, where it's like close friends that you would like connect with emotionally, basically, and support one another emotionally. I'm not sure that that's really what the 15th Lunar Mansion can do, but it's more about like having supportive people around you, like who are able to help you advance like in a career, or kind of like the career networking kind of thing, like having a good network like that, which can be supportive in its own way, just not kind of in the same way that we would probably interpret friendship and what it entails today. So just something to kind of keep in mind with that. Taking a look at our election chart, though, we've got the moon conjoined the ascendant here in the 15th Lunar Mansion, and here she's applying the square to Mercury. I don't normally super care for squares, but having a connection with a good planet that is that can do the business is better than having no connection at all. And Mercury here can definitely do the business of helping to create money and wealth and trades, which is what Mercury is all about, the commerce and the networking involved in there. So overall, I think that's good. Mercury also rules the first house from the 10th house, and is not afflicted by Mars or Saturn or anything like that. We're getting a little close to Mercury being combust, but we're not there yet, so we still have some time to be able to dodge that. So all in all, just kind of a standard, a nice 15th Lunar Mansion talisman to take a look at if you need it. So our next electional opportunity is not really like a standard election for kind of the way that I normally operate, since it's not a Lunar Mansion talisman, it's not a fixed star talisman, and it's not really a planetary talisman, though I guess you might be able to argue that it is. But this is a talisman that sort of serves as the mirror to what I was talking about last video in regards to the fourth Lunar Mansion. Where typically when we're crafting these electional charts for talismanic purposes, we're focusing more on building things up. So we want to make sure the moon is well placed, the ascendant is well placed and fortified and helped out by other things. But when we're talking more about like pest control, here we're leaning a little bit more into like the curse kind of mentality, where we're weakening the ruler of the first house, where we're weakening the ascendant, and we're hurting the moon, basically. So in the fourth Lunar Mansion, it was set up very well to be kind of like a general pest control. But I kind of talked about how aside from like the fourth Lunar Mansion, you can do pest control talismans at any time that the moon is severely afflicted. So all you have to do is kind of be aware of it, and then get the sign that most closely matches kind of the pest that you're up against or having to deal with on the ascendant. And that's kind of your best bet. If you can get the moon in the same sign as the ascendant afflicted, that matches the image of what you're dealing with. That's a good pest control talisman. So the fourth Lunar Mansion is in Taurus, and unless you live in the country to where you have to deal with like pesky deer. Like Taurus probably isn't a very good sign, but Scorpio on the other side of this is a really great sign, since it represents bugs, insects, stinging things, arachnids, so things that people normally don't want in their homes, right? So we're kind of lucky that we've got the Mars-Saturn opposition here, and between Leo and Aquarius to be able to square Scorpio. So this could be a really great opportunity for that on July 18th at just before 3 o'clock at 14:55, and like here in Texas, I have to deal with wasps and ants, but not for long, so that'll be fun. But this is just kind of like a way to use these more difficult moon aspects somewhat more constructively, or kind of target the laser beam, the celestial laser beam, celestial death ray, at things that we don't want around us. And that's kind of how we typically have to work around the more difficult aspects of the moon, is kind of taking the malevolent energy that they represent and focusing them on things that we don't need anymore, whether that's like internal processes, fears, anxieties, or like external agitators, such as like pests and bugs. And so you can do this with different signs of the zodiac, kind of matching the animals or the things that they represent or have signification over. So where like some of your signs are more farm animal related, so if you have to deal with pesky farm animals, then they'll be good friends for you, like Aries or Taurus. Even kind of the back half of Sagittarius can be good for it. Water-based creatures, of course, like in Pisces or Cancer, would be good. If you have pesky fish or turtles. I'm trying to rack my brain for random things that people would have to deal with that they don't want to deal with. People, if you don't want to deal with people, always, mood. Virgo, Aquarius, Gemini, the first half of Sagittarius. Birds. The birds are a good one because they're not where you would normally find them in the zodiac, but Virgo is good for birds if you have birds that you don't want to deal with. And also Pisces and Aquarius are good for birds, and there's like a whole story that I might go into about that one day. But those are kind of going to be, that's kind of your rough. Oh, and then Capricorn, which I mentioned before, is more for like rats and gophers, like small mammal pests, like that. And yeah, what makes this chart so good for this kind of pest control aspect is just because of how afflicted we have the moon. She's in Scorpio, which normally I don't super pay attention to because we're focused more on Lunar Mansion talismans. And there are Lunar Mansions in Scorpio and Capricorn, signs moon doesn't do well in. And so like essential dignity is not really a big problem or like a big focus there, because we're not really focused on the moon per se as much as we're focused on her ability to connect us to the Lunar Mansion that lies beyond. But here we are more focused on that. And then we have the moon caught between the square of Saturn and applying to the square of Mars, which means that she's classically besieged. So the moon's just like really beat up at this time, which is great for pest control, but not so great for the pests, I guess. So that's all for North America. Now we're going to kind of wrap up with the Australian charts. And our first electional opportunity for the Australian continent is going to be on July 14th at around 10 in the morning. This is set for 9:58. And this is that opportunity for the 13th Lunar Mansion talisman that I've talked about also in Western Europe and North American. So everybody gets the 13th Lunar Mansion talisman. Unfortunately, the Australian version I think is less neat. I think it's like the bottom of the it's not that great compared to the other two. But just because it's not that great doesn't mean that it's not serviceable. So the 13th Lunar Mansion is one that is primarily about strengthening or creating relationships, particularly those that are romantic, since there are very obvious erotic undertones to the imagery of the mansion. So not really one that's used for like friendships or platonic relationships. Really want to move it more focusing on romance or eroticism. That's fine too. That's what the talisman is more specifically used for. It also is used for the curing and overcoming of sexual dysfunction. So either of those things this talisman is really useful for. It's more focused on like the male part of it than the female, which tends to find its representative in the 19th Lunar Mansion, but it's a good kind of like general sexual health talisman. Taking a look at our election chart, we have the moon here conjoined the ascendant, which is different from the other two, where North America and Western Europe had the moon on the midheaven. So here the moon is conjoined the ascendant in the 13th Lunar Mansion, and she's applying the sextile to the sun. At the same time, Mercury is the ruler of the first house, and this is why the other two, the North American and the Western European / North Africa, chart is better, I think, because in those charts you were able to get the moon on the midheaven. Actually, I wonder if we can do that right now. No, right, that's the problem. So the reason why you can't have the moon on the midheaven in this chart, or in the 13 Lunar Mansion chart for Australia, has to do with how the houses line up in this location. So with North America and Western Europe, they were able to have the moon on the midheaven and still maintain a Scorpio ascendant, which pointed them to Mars, of course, as the ruler of Scorpio. But as you can see in this chart, Mars is the ruler of the 12th house, and Jupiter is the ruler of the ascendant. And you can't do that because Jupiter is retrograde, and you don't want to have retrograde planets involved. Either the moon applying to retrograde planets or the ruler of the first house being a retrograde planet. So that's why we can't have the retrograde. That's why we can't have the moon on the midheaven in this 13th Lunar Mansion talisman. She has to be on the ascendant, like here, which means that Mercury will have to be the ruler of the first house if we have to do this. Okay, so this is why the Australian version is less ideal than or basically inferior. I'll say that it's inferior to the North American and Western European charts, in my opinion, because we have to deal with whereas the Western European and North American charts had Scorpio on the ascendant, which let us utilize this conjunction of Mars and Venus, with Scorpio on the ascendant ruled by Mars and the descendant in Taurus ruled by Venus, and that connection, that symbolism. Now we have to deal with Mercury and Jupiter as rulers of the first and seventh houses. And while they are connected in a trine, it's kind of mutually separating. So it's kind of it's a weird energy to incorporate into a 17th Lunar Mansion, where you have the planets signifying the ruler of the first and seventh moving away from one another. It's kind of weird, right? Like that, like it's a weird symbolism. So in that regards, this is a more inferior chart. The chart with the Jupiter, with the Mars and Venus ruling the first and seventh is definitely better, as it connects things more symbolically. So what we're really leaning into here is the moon's connection with the sun to kind of bring it about. So we still have kind of the basic skeleton of the 13th Lunar Mansion talisman that could bring results. It doesn't have like the meat on it to continue our weird skeletal anatomy analogy that the charts for North America and Western Europe had. So it's not as great, but it can get you there. It can get you something if you're in a situation to where you could possibly use it. So the next electional opportunity for Australia is going to be on July 18th at around noon. This chart is set for 11:56. And here we're going to have an opportunity for a 17th Lunar Mansion talisman. And the 17th Lunar Mansion is really one that is more about the protection of property and assets. So it's our asset protection talisman, particularly more utilized for like prevention, to prevent thievery. Thievery? To prevent theft. That was a weird way to word it. So you can kind of utilize this in a couple interesting ways. You can utilize it, of course, for the protection of credit card information or personal identification information in regards to prevention of identity theft. You can use it in regards to, like anti-burglary by putting it up in the home. Those there's a decent amount of ways to utilize this talisman, which I think makes it definitely one of the higher ones to prioritize, just because it is kind of flexible and kind of the idea of identity theft or having information stolen online, especially now, is much more of a prevalent concern, I think, for many of us. Or maybe it doesn't begin as a concern, but it quickly becomes one. I don't think it's something that we spend a lot of time, thinking or worrying about until it happens to us, right? So in this election, we have the Moon conjoined the Ascendant in the 17th Lunar Mansion, and at this time she's applying a trine to Mercury. And I really like Mercury connections with the 17th Lunar Mansion. Its image is of a monkey, which is a Mercury-ruled animal. There's the whole, about theft and deceitfulness and preventing it, that the 17th Lunar Mansion is about. And I kind of really like the idea of Mercury involved in it because of its own associations with theft and stuff. There was, a show on TLC or something some time ago called It Takes a Thief, where thieves would stage break-ins of property, either private or personal or businesses, to test security features and things like that. And that's kind of what this reminds me of, these connections with Mercury and 17th Lunar Mansions. So I really kind of like that. We have Mars as ruler of the first house here in Leo, conjoined Venus, so we kind of have that benefic bump, we're going to call it, of protection with the first house. So I would really kind of like that. So all in all, I think this is a pretty solid 17th Lunar Mansion talisman. There are things in it that could be better. I would have liked to see the ruler of the second house doing better than being retrograde in its sign of domicile in the fifth house. But other than that, I think that's okay. And then our last electional chart for Australia and for the video is just going to be that talking about the pest control talisman, the general pest control talisman, that's available for Australia on July 19th at around 12:40. And kind of like I talked about before, if you remember in the fourth lunar, in the last video, I talked about the fourth lunar mansion and how in situations like that, when we're talking about pest control, we lean more into pulling into tearing down the moon, into afflicting the moon and the ascendant, and just treating it really badly to be able to direct that kind of celestial malefic energy towards something that we want to get rid of. This is kind of how I typically utilize waning moon talismans, is by kind of recontextualizing their purpose, not to be against a person or a location, but to be against something we don't like, something that's not something internal that is holding us back. Or it's more trying to use it more for shadow work, maybe, is how it would get kind of lumped in today, which I think is a much better application of kind of waning moon talismans. We have to give up something a lot, so we might as well choose to give up things that hold us back. So kind of taking this more old school style, I guess, we're kind of taking this terrible moon energy here in the sign of Scorpio, and square Mars and Saturn, and putting it towards bugs, basically. We're putting it towards a pest that we no longer want. And so with the sign Scorpio rising, we more easily fall into using this talisman or having it aimed more towards bugs, arachnids, stinging things, since the sign Scorpio naturally brings up or is similar to those things. It's a scorpion, right? Scorpio the scorpion. And so it's kind of the celestial representative of its more terrestrial individuals, these kind of bugs that we don't typically want in our home. So this could be a really great time to make kind of a general pest control talisman that might be worth looking into if you're currently struggling with any sort of bug problem. You could do something very similar, having the moon afflicted in other signs of the zodiac, having her on the ascendant then, and kind of sticking that negative malefic energy towards whatever the sign represents. So farm animals is animals that we don't want to deal with, an Aries, Taurus, even Sagittarius. If you have to deal with farm animals, maybe you don't want to, that's fine. I think a lot of deer who might eat people's gardens, especially in more rural areas. The sign Capricorn is good for rats, gophers, rabbits, more mammalian pests. And then you can, if you don't want to deal with people, you've got your humane signs of Gemini, Virgo, Libra, Aquarius, that you would put on there if you just are tired of people. Yeah. And then if birds are a problem, Virgo, Pisces, and Aquarius would be signs that you would utilize for that. So just kind of keep an eye on that. Anytime the moon is really afflicted in the sign and you're struggling with pests, it might be worth looking into whether or not you can make kind of a general pest control talisman to help you out with that. But alrighty, everybody, thank you so much for being here with me today. We've got a good collection of talismans of kind of different purposes to be able to utilize. Western Europe definitely has the most, of course, but even North America and Australia has a few things that they can work with. But everybody take care, and I will see everybody again on our first of 2 Aquarius full moons.